Hello and welcome back to How to Make a Game in Unity for Beginners. My name is Dustin, and what we're going to be doing is basically just creating like a floor and a player for our to sit on our floor, and we can kind of move them around and whatnot. We're going to keep it pretty simple and basic. So what I want to do is in the hierarchy here, I want to right click and I want to create a 3D object. We're going to go ahead and create a cube. If we go over here to the transform, and what the transform is basically like its position, rotation, and scale within our game. I'm just going to go ahead and reset the transform, and this is all based off of X, Y, and Z axis. If we move around on this position, it will update in our scene view. So I'm just going to go ahead and reset that. Reset the transform of this. I want to change the scale of this to 20 on the x-axis, and I want to do 20 on the z as well. Now we can't see it in our game view, and that's because our camera is not actually even facing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset the transform on the camera so it's directly in the center. I'm going to bring it up on the y-axis to about 10. And then we're going to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis so it's facing directly down at our floor. So from here, what I want to do is on the cube here, I'm just going to click on it twice to rename it. We're going to call this ground. We're going to right click on our asset folder. We're going to create a new material here, and we're going to call this ground material or ground mat. And what a material is basically what gives this object color or texture and whatnot. And I'm just going to go ahead and click this white box here. We're going to change the color to, let's do like a green looking color. And if we just click and drag that material onto our ground will turn to green. Perfect. So now what I want to do is I'm going to create a new 3D object again. I'm going to call it cube. I'm going to reset the transform. And you'll see that the cube is like right in the middle of our floor, which is not what we want. So I'm going to bring the Y position up to 1 so that it's sitting on top of our floor, just like that. I'm going to rename this cube to player, and I'm going to give it a material as well. So we're going to create a new material. We're going to call this player mat, and I'm going to change the color to, let's do red. I'm going to attach that material to our player, and perfect. So now we have a player that we can kind of move around. We have a floor that it can move around on. So if we go ahead and hit play, you will see that we cannot do anything in our game. And the reason that is we need to create a script that tells our player to do something. So what I'm going to do is in our project folder, we're going to create a new C# script, and we're going to call this script, we're going to say player controller, just like that. So want to make sure when we're naming this, there are no spaces in the name, because it will add that name into our coding. It'll show a little preview right here of the name and a little bit of what's inside of our code. And Unity won't register the spaces in between the names. So once we do that, we're going to click and drag that script onto our player, and if we highlight the player and scroll down in our inspector, you'll see that we have a new component here called the player control script. So what we're going to do is if we double click right here where it says script player controller, it will open up in Visual Studio. Now when you first open up Visual Studio, just like Unity, it might take a minute for it to load up. Visual Studio tends to be fairly slow on its initial boot up. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and I will be back when it's done. Alright, now that Visual Studio is finally open about 3 minutes later, what we want to do is we need to create a couple of variables. So what we need is we need a private rigid body, and we're going to call this rigid body the player. So now what a rigid body is, if we go ahead and save this and go back into Unity, it'll compile here and it'll have this little circle loading thing here. Once it compiles, what will happen is, so that's right, we listed this as private. So what we can do, so private, there's two different ways we can do variables. There's private and there's also public. If we set this as public, what it'll do is it'll show up here in the inspector on our controller script. And just like that, we have the variable name, the player, and the rigid body slot that we want to reference. Now, our player, we didn't actually attach a rigid body to it. Basically, what a rigid body is it allows us to add physics to our player or any object. So if we go ahead and click Add Component, and up here at the top, we can just search for rigid body, and it gives you two options, rigid body 2D and rigid body. They're basically the same thing, but they are for two different types of objects. One is for a two-dimensional object, the other is for a three-dimensional object. If you're creating a 3D game, you want to make sure you choose rigid body and not rigid body 2D. So if we go ahead and just hit enter on that, it brings up this other component here. You can change the mass, drag, angular drag. You can use gravity or not use gravity and whatnot. So first thing that I want to do is I want to drop down this constraints, and I want to freeze the rotation because I don't want it to rotate at all on all of the axes. Then I'm also going to freeze the position because what's going to happen is we have gravity turned on here. So if we drag this up and if we click play, our player will just fall to the floor just like that because there's gravity. Now what's going to happen is if our player comes all the way over here to the edge and it can fall off the edge of our play field, I just want to kind of avoid that altogether, and I'm going to freeze the position on the y-axis so that when we bring our player all the way over to the edge, it won't just fall off the edge, just like that. So what do I want to do now? So basically the difference between public and private is public is going to allow it to be changed here in this inspector. It's also going to allow other scripts to easily access this variable. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this as public. And what I want to do is down here for this rigid body slot, I just want to click and drag this rigid body component into that slot. So now our script is referencing the rigid body attached to our player. So now in the update function, what I want to do is I want to make a couple of if statements here. We're going to say if input dot get key, and in parentheses, key code dot W. And what that's going to say is if our user input presses a specific key and that specific key code is the W button, we want it to do something, which we will list within these curly brackets here. And what do we want to do? We want to basically move this player. The way we can do that is we can just type in player dot add force, and then we are going to tell it where to add the force. To add force, it's asking for basically 3 separate numbers, and what we're going to use is basically just X, Y, and Z. So if we change one of these numbers, we're looking at the X-axis here, the Y-axis here, and the Z-axis here. What do we want to do? So when we press the W key, we want it to go up on our screen. So basically we want it to make a change on the Z-axis. So we can just go ahead and change this. Let's just go ahead and see what it does if we set it to 100. So if we save that and go back into Unity, let it compile down here, and if we hit play, now what's going to happen is when we press the W button, our player is going to move forward. Perfect. So let's go back into Unity, and let's do the same thing for our A, S, and D keys. So if we just highlight this, copy, and paste it a couple of times right below it. Do that again. Copy, and paste. We don't have to rewrite all of this out. So instead of the W key here, I want to use the S key for down. I want to use the A key for left. I want to use the D key for right. So now we also need to change what axis these are all going on. So if we want to go down, we don't want to give it a force of 100 on the x-axis, but we still want to move it on the x-axis. So what we can just do is make this a negative number. To go left, actually we're going to do right first. We want to change this z-axis back to 0, and now we want to move it on the x-axis 100, and then to move left by pressing the A key, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to change this back to 0, and we're going to change the x-axis to negative 100. So now if we go ahead and save, go back into Unity, let it compile, and press play, all 4 of our keys should be working to kind of move around the player. Just like that. Perfect. So now I feel like this is a little fast. We can change that. So what I want to do is we can actually create a variable where we can control what our speed, how much force we're giving it here in our inspector. So the way we do that is we go up to the top here, right below our player variable, we're going to create a new public float, which is in reference to a number. It can be any number, whether it be a whole number or a decimal number. We're going to call this speed, just like that. So now I want to replace all of these hundreds and negative hundreds, actually just all the hundreds, with speed, just like that. And we're going to keep this as a negative speed where we had the negative 100. Just like that. and just like that. Now if we go ahead and save this in Unity, or save this and go back to Unity, in our player controller script, we now have a number here that we can just change. And whatever number is put in here will be whatever this add force is going to reference. So we can go ahead and change that to 100. Actually, I wanted to bring it down some. I'm going to put it at 75. And if we hit play, it's going to be just a little bit slower for us. And we can go ahead and change this to whatever number we want. If we want it slower, we can make it slower. If we want it faster, we can make it faster. Just like that. See, now it's not really, I mean, it is moving. If we look up here in the transform, maybe it's not moving at all. So that's just not enough force to even move it with the mass that it has. So I'm going to put this back to 75. And this seems good. So I think that is going to do it for this video. So yeah, be sure to like and subscribe. And thank you for watching this tutorial on how to create a game in Unity. And I will see you next time.